So last class we talked about the fact that there are in fact two primeval histories in Genesis 1 through 11 that are contradictory in all sorts of respects. Right? And we saw this in the creation accounts, we saw this in the flood, and we should probably stop and say to ourselves, wait a second, didn't Moses write all of it? Even though, to be fair, it doesn't say that anywhere in the Pentateuch itself. Right? That's still like the norm, right? That the standard traditional perspective is Moses wrote the Pentateuch. This goes back all the way to the ancient rabbis from the Talmud. The Talmud, for those of you who are unfamiliar, is the roughly 6th century CE compilation of Jewish commentary on an earlier law. It doesn't matter. It's old. And the rabbis of the Talmud said very clearly, Moses wrote his own book, which is to say the book of Moses, which is to say the Pentateuch. Terrific. That's pretty straightforward, except for 8 verses that Joshua wrote. You know which 8 verses Joshua wrote according to the rabbis? So what was it? Somebody just said something. What was it? Yeah, of course. Right. The verses starting with Moses died are the 8 verses they mean. Right. But not that this wasn't even uncontroversial. Right. The rabbis themselves were like, Moses, there's a statement here, right? Joshua wrote those 8 verses because Moses can't write about his own death. And then some rabbis were like, no, he did write about his own death. And right, there's a tradition that Moses wept while God was dictating to him the verses about his death, etc. That's not heartless. You serious? All right. In the Middle Ages, in the 12th century, a really remarkable Jewish commentator named Abraham ibn Ezra noted that there were some other verses that Moses maybe couldn't have written. Just like, to gently point out a few. He was like, I'm not going to make a big deal out of it, but like probably in Genesis 12 when the text is talking about Abraham going to Canaan, and it says the Canaanites were then in the land. Right? That's the kind of thing, Ibn Ezra said, that you only say when the Canaanites aren't in the land anymore. Right? The Canaanites were in the land back then. Something you have to say, right, once they're gone. But when Moses was writing, the Canaanites were still in the land. Like, that's a weird thing for Moses to have said. And another one is Deuteronomy 1, the very first verse. These, the ones that to come, are the words that Moses addressed to all Israel on the other side of the Jordan. Well, Moses addressed Israel on the eastern side of the Jordan, right, in Moab. To say the other side, to describe that as the other side of the Jordan means this has to have been written on the Canaanite side of the Jordan, where Moses never got. So how could Moses say that? I don't have a slide for it, but my favorite verse that, I don't think it's even Ezra that pointed out, but later people who are doing the same game of like, what could Moses not have written? My favorite one is the verse in Numbers 12 that reads, now Moses was the most humble man on earth. Which, people I think rightly were like, ironic. Okay, so, the rabbis started recognizing that he couldn't have written all of it, despite the fact that the claim that he wrote it was their own claim. Ibn Ezra, picked out a few more verses, but was very careful because he didn't want to be labeled as problematic. So he sort of said, there's a few verses here that are worthy of our attention. And then he said, in what is a relatively famous phrase within Jewish circles, he said, the one who understands will understand. Right? So like, I'm not going to say it out loud, but you understand what I'm getting at. By the time of the Reformation, mosaic authorship was essentially discounted, right? And has been, for the most part, in scholarship since. So we want to be clear, though, did Moses write it or not is a historical problem. These are all things like, could Moses actually have written it? These are texts that seem to reflect a historical time after Moses, right? So maybe Moses couldn't have been the one who wrote it, which led to a whole variety of others. Somebody said Spinoza, right, famous 8th century philosopher, was like, Ezra wrote it, right? Okay, so like he's gotten rid of the Moses problem and created a new one in a sense. Those are historical problems, but there are purely literary problems, and in the 17th century already, scholars were noticing the same exact kinds of things that we were looking at last time when we were doing the flood story or creation. And there are essentially 3 categories of narrative problems. And these occur across texts and also within texts, within individual texts. So there's contradictions, right? So in the creation stories, the order of creation, right? What was created first, animals or humans? Right? That's a contradiction between 2 texts. In the flood story, how many animals did Noah bring? How long the flood lasted? Right? These are contradictions, right? Disputes about the facts of the matter. I'll bring up a couple that occur elsewhere. What's the name of Moses' father-in-law? Right? In Numbers 10, it's Reuel. In Exodus 3, it's Jethro. Where did Aaron die? According to Numbers, it was Mount Hor. And according to Deuteronomy, it's someplace called Mosera. Those are kind of like nitpicky kinds of details, maybe. But more sort of central to the text, where the tent of meeting, where God and Moses meet, where was it? According to Numbers, it is in the center of the camp, right? The Israelites camp around it in military formation. And according to Exodus, it's outside the camp. It's like somewhere at a distance. Those 2 things are not compatible. And this isn't just the name of someone. This is like, where is the place where God dwells, comes to visit, meets Moses? So the contradictions, right? That's one category. Another category is doublets. Again, we've seen doublets, right? The creation story is just writ large. It's a doublet, right? One creation story, second creation story. In the flood stories, we saw doublets also, right? The announcement of the flood, right? God says, I'm going to bring a flood, twice. God says, I'm never going to bring a flood again, twice, right? God gives Noah instructions about the flood, twice. So doublets happen. There's doublets, of course, elsewhere in the text. Jacob names a particular city Bethel, not once, but twice, which is weird. He names it Bethel, and then he names it Bethel again, and it's extra weird because, like, many chapters earlier, Abraham had already been to a place called Bethel. Same place. Again, yep, there it is. That's the one from Abraham, Genesis 12. Naming of a place called Beersheba. Again, Isaac names the place Beersheba twice. Probably Abraham the first time. How many times does Jacob need to be renamed Israel? You would think once would do, but it happens twice. In the story of the spies in Numbers, Israel is condemned to die in the wilderness. God feels the need to say that twice, which is weird. And you'll notice he says it once, and then the second time he says it, he adds a new person who's going to survive, right? Caleb will survive alone, according to the first time he says it, and then the second time it's Caleb and Joshua. So, doublets. And I will note that every doublet is not just the same thing happening again, but it always involves some sort of contradiction as well. Right? Things can happen twice, right? But can you, right? But can you say that the same thing happened twice in 2 different times, or in some cases at the same time, or to different people? So contradictions, doublets, and what I call discontinuities. That is, places where the story seems to be going along, and then like a whole bunch of other stuff happens, or something else happens, and then we come back to the place we were before, right? The story has got like a gap in it, a break in it. We saw that already, right? Genesis 1 goes along and ends, and then we've got like all this stuff in 2 through 4, and then 5 picks up right where 1 left off as if nothing had happened in between. Right, discontinuities. So that's an example. Here's a couple of other ones. This one's a little bit long, but you'll see, right, Exodus 24, God says to Moses, I want you to come up with Aaron, Nadav, and Avihu, and 70 elders, and bow low. That's what's going to happen. And you'd think that the next thing would happen is that would happen, but it doesn't. Then Moses goes, and he goes and chats with the people, and they do a whole covenant ceremony, and they throw blood on each other. And then Moses and Aaron and Nadav and Avihu and 70 elders of Israel ascend, and they see God. And so, like the story, there's just this unexpected stuff in the middle. Where did that stuff come from? Okay, that's one example. Here's my favorite. Here's my favorite example. In the famous scene where Jacob tricks Isaac by disguising himself as Esau, Isaac is on his deathbed, right? That's the premise. He's about to die, and he even says it, right? Like, let me bless you before I die. He's old, he's blind, he's about to die, he's got to give his like deathbed blessing, and that's the premise of the entire event. And then, glory be, 20 years later he dies, right? Right in between those two things, right? Jacob goes over to his family and the Arameans, and he meets Rebekah, and he meets Rachel and Leah, and has 12 kids, and comes back, and then Jacob dies, and then Isaac dies, and it's like a little bit, like that seems unreasonable. Discontinuities. Okay, so contradictions, doublets, and discontinuities. Now, if we paid attention only to these kinds of fractures in the text, and we just went episode by episode, creation, and got its problems, and floods got its problems, and this got this problems, we might think, okay, it's just made up a bunch of bits and pieces thrown together. A collection of fragments, as it were. And indeed, in the history of scholarship, there was a moment when this was the case. And people said, yes, the Pentateuch is just put together of a bunch of different fragments of text. Even suggested that Moses was the one who put the fragments together often. And this was called the fragmentary hypothesis, because they couldn't come up with very creative names. But what ruined the fragmentary hypothesis was the recognition that, as we've already seen, these stories are continuous, right? The claims made in one are picked up in another, even as that one is itself in contradiction with other stuff. Right, so Genesis 1 leads to the undoing of that creation in that flood story, and the recreation along the very same lines, and the curse on the ground in Genesis 3, which we followed through a little bit last time, and the removal of that curse, or the reference to it at least, in the second flood story. These aren't isolated texts, right? They share not just language and themes, but in fact just claims about who, what, when, where, and why. Oh yeah, I forgot that was to go in there, just to get the idea. Okay, so as we saw with the flood story, when you separate the things that don't belong together and you put together the things that do, when we did it in the flood story, we're like, oh, there's two stories here. When we do that over the course of the entirety of the Pentateuch, it turns out that there are four. You can imagine, right? We've got two stories going on from creation and flood, and we're reading, and okay, everything I'm reading is one of those two stories, and then suddenly something else comes up, and I'm like, this doesn't belong with either of the two stories I was just reading, and now I've got a third strand that starts and continues through. So there's four over the course of the entirety of the Pentateuch. Four distinct narratives, each one nearly complete and continuous and coherent, and each one, as far as we can tell, originally an independent document. That is, a text that existed on its own, independent of the others, and it is for that reason that we, similarly uncreative naming people, call this the documentary hypothesis. We should be clear that what we're describing here is not true exclusively of the narrative portions of the text. It is true of the law codes, too. There's not one law code in the Pentateuch. There are three of them. Right? They come in chunks. We have one in Exodus 20 to 23, another one in Leviticus and much of Numbers, and a third one in Deuteronomy. And these law codes have all the same issues, maybe not discontinuity, but have doublets and contradictions, just like the narratives do. In fact, we have triplets, right? Every single one of these three law codes has its own festival calendar. Do the festival calendars agree with each other? They do not. right? They all have slave laws, right? How do you treat a slave? Also don't agree with each other. They have asylum laws, right? How does somebody who is accidentally murdered someone or accidentally killed someone seek asylum? All right, again, those occur in all three of these law codes, right? If we were talking about a single unified composition, we wouldn't quite need the repetition, and certainly wouldn't need the contradiction embedded in the repetition. There's triplets, there's doublets. Two of these law codes have what we call altar laws, laws about where and how to build altars to God. For example, Exodus says, make for me an altar of earth and sacrifice on it. Essentially, wherever you build an altar, it's cool, right? That's where I'm going to come and bless you. And Deuteronomy says, you cannot do this anywhere you want, but only in this one place. So it's not just a doublet, it's a doublet and a contradiction. There are kosher laws in multiple law codes. There's kosher laws in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy, and they're not exactly the same, even though they're similar. There are laws about tithing in multiple ones. And there are laws about slaughtering animals, which is a thing they cared about more than we do. Deuteronomy says, whenever you want, if you decide you want to kill an animal and eat it, go for it. It's fine. And Leviticus says, if you do that, but you don't then bring the animal as a sacrifice, as an offering to God, you're in trouble. So again, that's two laws about slaughter, but they ain't the same laws, they're contradictions. And I should note, we think about biblical law and narrative as two separate things, but they're not really. These law codes are, of course, embedded in narratives. These are laws that are given by God, usually to Moses, at a certain place in Israel's past. Right? So the laws in Exodus, we're told, are given by God to Moses up on the top of the mountain. And the laws in Leviticus are given by God to Moses down at the bottom of the mountain. And the laws in Deuteronomy were given to Moses back at the mountain at Sinai in the wilderness, but weren't delivered by Moses to the people until 40 years later. Right? So there's narrative structures that embed in which the laws are embedded. And so when we talk about narratives being contradictory and laws being contradictory, we're not really talking about two separate phenomena. Right? We're talking about one narrative tells me at this certain point God said this to Moses, and another narrative, doubling the idea but contradicting it, says, no, God so told Moses these laws at this time. Okay. So again, as I said last time, the fact that we can take the Pentateuch and extract from it four essentially coherent and continuous and complete documents shouldn't be possible, right? This is not a thing that you can make work artificially. You can't make all the pieces come together this way. The only way this really works is if it's what's going on in the text. So let me give you a brief overview of these four narratives, these four texts that we find in the Pentateuch. In order of their appearance in the text, we call them P, J, E, and D. I'm going to explain why, but you're not going to like me for it. But this is what they're called, P, J, E, and D. These are all abbreviations, as you might imagine. The easiest ones first. D is named for the person called the text author called the Deuteronomist. It's the Deuteronomistic source, or the Deuteronomic source, which you might suspect has something to do with Deuteronomy, and indeed, the D source is located entirely in the book of Deuteronomy and occupies 90+%, maybe not that much, 90% of the book of Deuteronomy comes from the D source. I already showed you in some of the contradictions and doublets I put on the board that Deuteronomy seems to disagree, for example, where did Aaron die, and about various legal stuff. Deuteronomy has its own perspective on things and is its own source for the very most part. The next one, moving up from the bottom, is called the Elohist, and it gets annoying here. Why would we call something the Elohist? I wouldn't call it now if I were starting to name them from scratch, but unfortunately I'm left with 19th century, German Protestant scholarly ideas for names. The idea here is that this is the source, this is the document within the Pentateuch, that in the book of Genesis doesn't really use the divine name Yahweh, right? Instead, it suggests that people didn't really know that name until it's revealed to Moses at the burning bush in Exodus 3. And so people starting with Genesis said, I've got a source here that just says the Hebrew word Elohim, which is the Hebrew word for God, right? Doesn't use God's proper name. It always refers to the deity as Elohim, and we're going to call this author the Elohist for the person who likes the name Elohim, or the title Elohim. There is the P source, again, easy name, this one, which is so called because it's the one that seems to care about all the priestly stuff. Leviticus, that belongs to P, right? That's priestly, cultic, ritual. It's the dry stuff. It's also Genesis 1. It's also Genesis 1 and the red flood story of the stories that I've been showing you. I particularly am fond of the priestly source, but it is in times very difficult to read. But anyway, when you come across stuff and you're like, boy, that's a lot of stuff about ritual and cult and sacrifice, you're probably looking at the priestly source. And the last one is J, which is the most annoying because it's very much Germanic. J for Jahvist in German. If we had come up with it, it would be the Y source, right? Because this is the author who, starting in Genesis, has people addressing the deity by the divine name Yahweh from the very beginning. So the Yahwist and the Elohist are the two that sort of are named in opposition to each other. One source uses Yahweh, one source uses Elohim, and those two fight it out. And the priestly source is the one that cares about the priestly stuff, and the Deuteronomistic source is the one that cares about Deuteronomy. Okay? One of the things, as I've said, that marks them off, and that you will often see is like the determining, like main thing you learn if you have read any introductory stuff about this anywhere, is it's really all about the use of the divine name, right? Like that's how we tell these sources apart. They use the divine name differently, and indeed, E says in Exodus 3, when Moses says, when I go to the Israelites and I say and they ask me what your name is, what do I tell them? And the E source has Moses say, so you tell them Yahweh has sent you. That's going to be my name. We're going to go by Yahweh now, right? So yes, that's what E says. And P also thinks that God's proper name wasn't revealed until the time of Moses, right? Has God's first words to Moses in the priestly source are, I am Yahweh, and I used to be known as El Shaddai, or God Almighty, to the ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but I didn't let them know my real name, which again is Yahweh. And that's how the priestly source introduces the question of the name of God, whereas the J source has all the way back, and I'll show you this verse in a different context, all the way back in Genesis 4, in the third generation of humanity, has people already invoking Yahweh by name. Okay, so here's what looks like a pretty good argument. Like, when I'm dividing sources, I can just go by what name they use. Well, not really, because both P and E think that Yahweh's name wasn't really used before Moses. And in any case, what we're talking about here isn't what the narrator knows about God's name, but what the characters in the story know. Right? Who knows that God's name was Yahweh? I guarantee J and E and P all knew that God's name was Yahweh. They're going to get there in the story eventually. Like, they know. So the claim isn't, the authors of these biblical texts use or like certain divine names. It's, according to these stories, the characters know or don't know the divine name. Which is to say, divine names aren't a stylistic feature of the authors of the biblical texts. They are, again, like everything else, they're one of the narrative claims of the texts themselves. Right? My point here is that though often we are presented with the criteria for determining sources is like word choice, right? This author uses this name for God, this one uses another name for God. This one uses this word, this one uses a different word. You will find word lists all over the place in these kinds of things, as if the way you can tell one source from another is which words they use or the style that they write in. And I'm here to tell you not. Style is not how you divide up a text. If we got a flood story, for example, that was completely coherent in all of its narrative details, right? All the stuff we looked at last time, none of that existed. It's a perfectly normal flood story, and it occasionally used like 2 different words for, I don't know, for God, right? If occasionally it said Yahweh and occasionally it said Elohim, you wouldn't look at it and be like, well, that can't be, right? Well, sometimes it uses this word for dry land and sometimes it uses that word for dry land. Okay, like we wouldn't separate the story on the basis of style, right? Style, variation of style, isn't the presenting literary problem of the Pentateuch, right? Which is another way of saying it shouldn't be the literary solution to the Pentateuch because there's nothing to solve. Style is not a basis for dividing the text. Again, think about how we did the flood story, right? When we divided the flood story, we paid 0 attention, right? None of the stuff that bothered us in the flood story last time was about style or wording, right? It was all about who, what, when, where, why, etc., right? Like narrative claims, that's what the issue was. But guess what? The flood story also, turns out, the 2 stories also have stylistic features that are unique to each one, right? The first story, which I can now identify as the priestly story, right, refers to all the creatures that die as all flesh, like over and over again. And J never says all flesh. The second story never says all flesh. It uses a different word, all existence. Right? These may look like synonyms, and they are synonyms, right? Destroy and blot out, right? If you could use both words, that's fine. But it turns out P likes the word destroy in the flood story, and J says blot out, and they don't ever say the other one. P says perish, and J says die. P says the earth, and J says the ground. P says male and female, and J says male and its mates. Right? Again, none of these are important in terms of content. Right? This is pure style. Right? But we didn't talk about this at all. We didn't need to, right? Because you wouldn't look at, again, a coherent text in terms of plot that varied between these phrases. You would never in a million years be like, well, one person couldn't possibly say all flesh and also say all existence. That's crazy. Must be 2 authors. You'd never say it, right? But 150 days and 40 days, like, has to be 2 authors, right? Because one person can't say that. And so once we've done the separation on the basis of the plot, of the narrative, right, then we look at our 2 stories and realize, oh my God, I did the separation without it, but like it turns out that like style falls into the columns too. In other words, stylistic features confirm our analysis, or confirm our separation. They don't determine it. Right? You can't pick up a text and look at its wording and be like, I'm going to find 2 texts here. That's not the presenting problem. So as you read people talking about composition of the Pentateuch or its documentary hypothesis or sources or any of these things, really be wary of and mentally push back against the notion that what we're talking about is who uses which word, right? Every biblical author knew Hebrew, right? They all knew the words, right? But some authors favor certain words, right? That's just the way it is, and it's as true today as it ever was. So again, style and stylistic features of our texts, of our sources, emerge after the separation that's done on the basis of the narrative claims. And what is true of style is true also of theme. Right? One author can involve multiple themes in their text unproblematically. It turns out, though, that certain Pentateuchal documents and sources are particularly fond of certain themes. Right? And they bring them up over and over again. Does that mean that another biblical author or another Pentateuchal text can't refer to that theme? Of course not. Right? Like themes aren't, like style, aren't like held in like possession by one person over another. But we do find themes and structure, narrative structure, right? Literary structure, right? the priestly source has a particular structural style that emerges once we're reading it as a text, but you couldn't really go looking for it. Right? It's just something you see afterward. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention. Back in the flood story, when we were doing the various separations, another thing that we totally didn't talk about or mention or bring up at all is the fact that the two stories actually do use two different names for the deity. The P story says God every time, and the J story says Yahweh every time. But again, that's not the rationale, that's not the basis on which we had to go about determining sources. It just happens to be the case after the fact. So, 4 sources. Whew. When were these written and by whom? That would be interesting to know, wouldn't it? To get at this, I need to introduce the figure in the history of scholarship named Julius Wellhausen. I say it that way mostly as a joke to myself. I have a colleague who shall go unnamed, not at this institution, who every time he says this name, says it in like this very thick German accent. Like he's an American guy. He's just like, anyway, blah, 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 Julius Wellhausen. And it's like, it's so funny every time. Anyway, Julius Wellhausen is what I'm going to say. Wellhausen is sort of the godfather of the documentary hypothesis. Not that he came up with it. It's just that he popularized it in a really really well done way. But part of the reason that Wellhausen's explanation of these sources was so compelling is that he didn't just say, well, here's the sources and what their texts are. He said, I can put these texts in chronological order and thereby show the development of Israelite religion. Right? I can show you how Israelite religion came to be. And this is the scheme that Wellhausen came up with, right? And the order he put them in. There's J, and then E, and then D, and then P. And he was thinking very much about the practice of religion as described in these texts. And he looked at J, and he said, J, the ancestors build altars, and God comes down and speaks to them directly, and it's very naturalistic. And it's sort of theologically naive, as I have it here. But, the notion of direct communication with the deity, and there's no larger religious superstructures. It's very, it's a very earthy kind of religion, as it were. And E seems to be a little bit more theologically advanced. I've got messengers and dreams, and it's a little bit less direct as a religion. And then I've got the D source, the one in Deuteronomy, and now I'm starting to get sort of laws more firmly. And I've got the instruction, as I put on the board earlier, that worship can only happen in one place. So I've got a centralization of worship in the temple. Right? That seems to be an advance over J and E, which have you sacrificing wherever you want to. And then I have the priestly stuff in Leviticus, right? Which essentially, in Wellhausen's view, exterminated from Israelite religion any of that early kind of direct, earthy connection with God stuff. And now I've got priests, and now I've got ritual, and I got rules, and I have sacrifice, and it's all very formalized and decadent in the older sense, right? Not the like, oh, that's like really nice chocolate cake, but like, it's not natural, right? It's very much. It's degraded, really, right? Decadent comes from the word decay, and it's got no spirit to it anymore, right? Now, this was Wellhausen's scheme. Wellhausen, who was writing in the second half, late second half of the 19th century, when certain other ideas were bubbling up in the world, notably. A dude named Darwin was writing around this time, and what we can see here is a notion of evolution, an evolutionary scheme applied to Israel's religion. Other things that were going on around this time were things, I don't know if it was a rise or just like the nonstop existence of anti-Semitism in Germany, and when you look at the way that Wellhausen's scheme goes here, you will note that what he sees as the latest part and the worst, right, it's non-spiritual, it's legalistic, right? This, Wellhausen very openly was like, and that's basically Judaism. But to be fair to Wellhausen, he also, what he really meant was, that's Catholicism, right? Wellhausen, like virtually every major 19th century German theologian and biblical scholar, was Protestant. And in this, he was essentially saying, this is the degradation of Israelite religion as we can see in antiquity, from J to P. P looks a lot like Catholicism. Protestantism is like appealing to J, right? We're getting rid of priests, right? We're getting rid of the intermediaries. We're getting rid of the formal structures. We're going back to kind of direct connection. And this was what was in the air, and this was in Wellhausen's mind. And this is why I don't like this, now that you've all taken such extensive notes on it. It's good to know. It's good to know. I would suggest that, in fact, what we're talking about when we look at the Pentateuch is not a sequence of religious development in Israel's past, as if all of Israelite religion was one thing, and then it was all another thing. Like, there is no part in human history where everybody in any culture agreed on stuff like that, right? Peter and Paul were at it in the first, right? That's right, Peter and Paul. Cool. And yeah, I mean, the same thing happens in Islam, right? One generation in, where the whole thing, right, it splinters, and it's still splintered. Judaism, right? In any case, this notion of like, yes, these texts represent the state of Israelite religion writ large is a bit absurd on the face of it. What we should be thinking about, rather than sort of this evolutionary scheme, is the idea of a multiplicity of voices existing in one culture at the same time. Now, I'm not saying that these are all written simultaneously, but I'm saying there's no reason to think that one couldn't think like the priestly source at the same time that someone else in ancient Israel was thinking quite differently, like the J source. No reason, right? You're all sitting here at the Yale Divinity School, and everyone around you thinks differently about stuff, right? At the same time, right? No one would write like a history of American Christianity and be like, well, then in 2021, everybody thought this, right? Like clearly not. There's no reason to think that that would be true in antiquity either. So then who wrote these things and when? I mean, we can do very broad kinds of things. Potentially. No, I'm not even giving you. Like, we can say certain things like it seems like the J source has some affiliation with the royal court, generally a kind of common claim. Going on sort of the themes, right? I assume that the people who wrote the priestly source were priests, right? Then again, I assume the people who wrote the Deuteronomic source were also priests. There seems to be, the E source seems to have something to do with prophets. It really likes prophets. So thematic connections provide some clues, but we're basically guessing, right? And what I want to be clear about is that for the purposes of reading the text and seeing the divisions among the various sources, it doesn't matter who wrote it or when, right? It's just not important. We can only ask the questions about who might have written this once I know what the thing is I'm asking about. Right? I have to read the text and say, this doesn't go with this, and do all the work of separating and identifying my documents. And then I can say, boy, that one really is pretty obsessed with sacrifice. Right? That's probably from a priest. My main point is, people get really hung up on the identity of the authors of these texts, and we probably shouldn't. In part because we just don't know. We probably can't know. And in part because there's no reason to think that these texts are texts that were written at one time by one person. Right? These are texts that probably were the product of schools of thought and that were edited and manipulated and changed over the course of centuries within those individual schools. right? It would be like picking up the Constitution now with all of the amendments and being like, well, who wrote, when was the Constitution written? Like, I know when it was started. It's not even done yet, right? Like, those kinds of things. Okay. So, again, attention to inconsistencies and consistencies throughout the Pentateuch results in 4 documents. We do our analysis on the basis of narrative claims with the understanding that it is only after we have understood these texts on their own that we can start asking questions about style and terminology and theme and structure, all of which emerge secondarily and confirm our separation, but can't drive it. Okay. Taking apart the canonical text is only half of the battle, right? Like, it's super fun to do what we did with the flood story and be like, look, I made 2 texts out of 1. We should also ask, how did these 4 documents end up looking like they do now, which is to say, all smushed together into one basically incoherent Pentateuch? So again, when we ask, like, how did this happen, the questions of who, what, when, where, and why for the bringing together of it also kind of have to come second. Our only direct evidence for the process of compilation, of compiling these texts, comes from the text itself. Right? So the only way we can know anything about how this happened is to look at what the text tells us about what happened. So what are the characteristics of our compiled text? Well, it's full of contradictions. What does that tell me? Whoever did it wasn't trying to get rid of contradictions. Right? If they were, there wouldn't be any, and I wouldn't have a job. Virtually all of the text in the Pentateuch is text that is from the original documents, right? So which suggests that there wasn't a great desire to add to the sources. There's not some like overarching like film or layer of editorial work here, right? The language, the text is the text of the sources, not the text of the editor. As we saw with the flood story, the canonical text preserves its documents, its sources, in their original order. Okay, so I guess that whoever did this wasn't trying to rearrange the sources. Again, which is sort of the same as the first point, right? Coherence, in our sense, wasn't clearly the aim. And of course, the text is in chronological order, right? That is, whoever did this wanted to create one continuous story in chronological order, even though that then creates contradictions, right? Everything in the flood story, right? I had the 2 flood stories, and they brought together, and the canonical flood story, everything happens in the right order. It's just full of contradictions and is weird. So from this, all of this, what we understand really is that the primary task of whoever brought these together seems to have been preservation, right? Preserving the source documents as much as possible and creating a text of them that could be read as a single story, right? Which of course we've been doing now for 2,000 plus years, 2,500 years. Once we have a sense of like the how, right? Preservation and chronologically continuous story. Once we have a sense of that, then we might start to think about answering the other questions, right? Who was this person, and when did it happen, and why, right? But if you remember, no matter what our answers to those questions might be, they don't affect what's happening in the text, right? The text's evidence is going to be what it's be, whether I tell you that the person who put it together lived in the 8th century BC or lived in the Reagan administration, right? It's the same text, right, with the same phenomena evident in it. So I don't know the answer. That said, I'm going to give you a little bit of a possibility, one possibility. In the book of Ezra, we learn that Artaxerxes, also known as the King of Kings, said to Ezra, the priest, scribe of the law of God of heaven, I'm commissioning you to administrate, right, I'm sending you back from Persia to Judah to run that place according to the law of your God, which is in your care. Okay, so I can imagine Ezra being like, awesome, I have 4 of them, right? And being like, no, one law would be great. Right? Let's just get like one law collection. So we have here the idea in the Bible that the Persian administration was like, I want, go back and rule Judah according to some sort of central law code, which I think probably by that point didn't exist otherwise. And then in the book of Nehemiah, we find the moment when Ezra assembles all the people, and he brings forward the Torah, and he reads from it. Okay, so I've got, like, here's the existence of the Pentateuch, basically, in our story. The thing is, it's clear from the story that the people have never heard this thing before. Right? They're not like, hey, bring out our good old Torah so we can all chant along. Right? When they read from it, they have to translate and interpret it as they go. Right? Again, which suggests that there's, and I'm not going to give you the rest of the story, but there's the moment in the story where essentially they finish reading the Torah and they all go, oh my God, it's Sukkot. We have to go celebrate, like they didn't know already. Right? Like it turned out it was a festival day that they realized upon hearing the Torah read to them. Again, all of which suggests they hadn't heard it before. So I'm not saying that Ezra is the person who put together the Torah. But I'm saying that even the Bible preserves a tradition of around when it might have happened and around why it might have happened, right? They needed a law to administer Judah. And the kind of person who would have done it, a scribe, an administrator. And the novelty of the thing in Israel's history. So all of the things we've been talking about here is what we call the documentary hypothesis. And again, and as I finish here, I want to just like clarify what this phrase really means, documentary hypothesis. 2 words. Documentary is the claim that there were 4 independent documents that were compiled into the single Pentateuch. That's the documents part. 4 independent documents. And the hypothesis part means that this is a proposed solution to a perceived problem. It's not a model. It's not to be applied anywhere else. Right? It's not an approach. It doesn't involve some kind of theory of reading that is not just reading. Right? It's not something that's imposed. The documentary hypothesis isn't imposed on the text. It emerges from the attempt to read the canonical text, and it explains only the present state of the canonical text. Right? It has no explanatory power outside of the phenomenon that it is trying to explain. What we're doing here is we're taking the literary problems of the Pentateuch and the Pentateuch alone and trying to explain, why does this text look like this? There could be a million historical reasons for the text to look like this. This is a hypothesis. It is just, at present, like the best, most concise, simplest, most convincing, to my mind, and now by rule to yours, theory. Right? I'm not going to, this is what I spend my life doing, this particular thing. I'm not going to spend the entire semester talking about it. It will come up again. It will, and it will be the basis for some things, right? When we're reading Leviticus, we'll be talking about like the uniqueness of the priestly worldview, for example. Occasionally, there'll be at least one lecture later on in the semester where I'm going to try and, not right away, but later on, I'm going to try and show like what good this is, how to use it as we read. So, and it'll be in the background of everything, but we're gonna move on. But this is pretty like this is pretty central stuff when reading the Pentateuch. I hope it will be explanatory for you as you read, and you're like, why did you say that again? Or why does that not sound like the thing I heard previously? And why are things so different now? And it's not, I don't expect you guys at all to be able to separate the sources, right? I'll do that for you as much as necessary. But to understand why we talk about it that way and why the text looks the way it is, I hope will be helpful. I wish I had time for questions. I don't. But save them for next time. Enjoy your weekends. I'll see you on Monday.